Hi everyone, I'm Miss Mary Beth. I'm the Youth Services Librarian at Ingalls Memorial Library in Range, and I'm here today for Armchair Adventures. And that's where every day I read a little bit of a book to you, a chapter or two of it, and eventually we finish a whole book together. And I'm pretty excited because today's the first day of a new book. The book we're reading right now is, the book we're about to start, is Peter Pan and Wendy by J.M. Barrie. And maybe you've seen the movie Peter Pan, the animated cartoon, or there are a lot of different versions of it. But I've never actually read the book myself, and I'm pretty excited to read it with all of you and then see how it's different from the movie, from the story that we all maybe know. And this book was originally written as a play in 1904, and then it was published as a book in 1911 so that everybody could read it. And it's the story of a boy who never grows up, who goes off to Neverland, where there are alligators and mermaids and pirates. So I'm also excited because I felt like this was a good way to kick off our summer reading program, Armchair Adventure series. Our summer reading program this year is all online when you listen to my virtual story times. And the theme is Imagine Your Story, which is a pretty cool theme because it encompasses so many things. It can be fairy tales or nursery rhymes or magic or princesses or dragons. So I thought Peter Pan kind of includes a lot of those things. And when you listen to this, when you watch our Armchair Adventures or any of our programs, I'm going to say a code word. And when you hear the code word, you can log on to your READSquared account and you can type in your code word. And that means that you watched it. I know you were listening. And then you get a raffle ticket. So every time you listen to an Armchair Adventure with me, not only are you reading a story together, but you're also getting a raffle ticket to be entered to win a bike. So then you come into the library and you tell me that you listened and you can show me your account. And then we get to give you a raffle ticket. So thanks for joining me on our Armchair Adventures today. Listen for the code word in a couple minutes, okay? So let's kick off. Peter Pan and Wendy. And this book is also beautiful because there are a lot of illustrations. And the pages are pretty big. Let's see. The first chapter is called Peter Breaks Through. All children, except one, grow up. They soon know that they will grow up. And the way Wendy knew was this. One day, when she was 2 years old, she was playing in a garden, and she plucked another flower and ran with it to her mother. I suppose she must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling, that's her mother, put her hand to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" This is all that passed between them on the subject, but henceforth Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you are 2. 2 is the beginning of the end. Do you guys all know that you're going to have to grow up? Growing up is okay. Of course, they lived at 14, and until Wendy came, her mother was the chief one. She was a lovely lady with a romantic mind and such a sweet mouth. Her romantic mind was like the tiny boxes, one within the other, that come from the puzzling East. However many you discover, there is always one more. And her sweet mouth had one kiss on it that Wendy would never get, though there it was, perfectly conspicuous in the right-hand corner. I hope we find out what that means. The way Mr. Darling won her over was this. The many gentlemen who had been boys when she was a girl discovered simultaneously that they loved Mrs. Darling, and they all ran to her house to propose to her, except Mr. Darling, who took a cab and swooped in first, and so he got her. He got all of her, except the innermost box and the kiss in the corner of her mouth. Mr. Darling never knew about the box, and in time he gave up trying for the kiss. Wendy thought Napoleon could have got it, but I can picture him trying, and then going off in a passion, slamming the door. What does that mean she has a secret kiss? Who gets the special secret kiss? I hope we find out. Mr. Darling used to boast to Wendy that her mother not only loved him, but respected him. He was one of those deep ones who knew about stocks and shares. Of course, no one really knows, but Mr. Darling quite seemed to know about all of that, and he often said stocks were up and shares were down in a way that would have made any woman respect him. This narrator's pretty silly. Mrs. Darling was married in white, and at first she kept the books perfectly, almost gleefully, as if it were a game, not so much as a Brussels spout was missing. But by and by, whole cauliflowers dropped out, and instead of them there were pictures of babies without faces. She drew them when she should have been totaling up. They were Mrs. Darling's guesses. Wendy came first, then John, then Michael. For a week or two after Wendy came, it was doubtful whether they would be able to keep her, as she was another mouth to feed. Mr. Darling was frightfully proud of her, but he was very honorable, and he sat on the edge of Mrs. Darling's bed, holding her hand and calculating expenses, while she looked at him imploringly. She wanted to risk it, come what may, but that was not his way. His way was with a pencil and a piece of paper, and if she confused him with suggestions, he had to begin at the beginning again. Now, don't interrupt, he would beg of her. I have £1.17 here, and 2 and 6 at the office. I can cut off my coffee at the office, say 10 shillings, making 2 and 9. With your 18, 3 makes 3, 9, 7, and 5 not in my checkbook makes 879. Who is that moving? 897. Dot carry 7. Don't speak my own. And the pound you lent to that man who came to the door. Quiet, child. Dot and carry, child. There, you've done it. Did I say 997? Yes, I said 997. The question is, can we try it for a year on 997? They're worried about money, right? I hope they can be okay. Of course we can try it, George, Mrs. Darling cried. But she was biased towards Wendy. She liked her daughter, didn't she? And he was really the grander character of the two of them. Remember, Mumps, he warned her almost threateningly, and off he went again. Mumps, £1, that is what I have put down, but I dare say it will be more like 30 shillings. Don't speak. Measles 1.5, German measles half a guinea makes 2 15.6. Don't waggle your finger, whooping cough, say 15 shillings. And on he went, and it added up differently every time. But at last Wendy just got through, with mumps reduced to 12.6, and 2 kinds of measles treated at one. It's expensive to have a kid, I think. There was but the same excitement over John, and Michael had even a narrower squeak. But both were kept, and soon you might have seen all 3 of the kids going in a row to Miss Folsom's kindergarten school, accompanied by their nurse. Mrs. Darling loved to have everything just so, and Mr. Darling had a passion for being exactly like his neighbors, so, of course, they had a nurse. As they were poor, owing to the amount of milk the children drank, their nurse was a prim Newfoundland dog called Nana, who had belonged to no one in particular until the Darlings engaged her. Have you ever seen the movie? Do you remember Nana? She's a big, fluffy, helpful dog. She's their nurse. She takes care of the kids. She had always thought children important, however, and the Darlings had become acquainted with Nana in Kensington Gardens, where she spent most of her spare time peeping into perambulators, and was much hated by careless nursemaids, whom she followed to their homes and complained of to their mistresses. Nana proved to be quite a treasure of a nurse. How thorough she was at bath time, and up at any moment of the night if one of her charges made the slightest cry. Of course her kennel was in the nursery. She had a genius for knowing when a cough is a thing to have no patience with, and when it needs a stocking round your throat. I guess that's kind of a medicine. Nana believed to her last day in old-fashioned remedies like rhubarb leaf, and made sounds of contempt over this newfangled talk about germs, and so on. It was a lesson in propriety to see her escorting the children to school, walking sedately by their side when they were well behaved, and butting them on the back into line if they strayed. On John's footer days she never once forgot his sweater, and she usually carried an umbrella in her mouth in case of rain. There is a room in the basement of Miss Folsom's school where the nurses wait. They sat on chairs while Nana lay on the floor, but that was the only difference. The nurses affected to ignore her as if an inferior social status to themselves, and Nana despised their talk. She resented visits to the nursery from Mrs. Darling's friends, but if they did come, she first whipped off Michael's pinafore and put him into the one with the blue braiding, and smoothed out Wendy and made a dash at John's hair. This is a very silly story, isn't it? Can a dog take care of kids that well? I don't think so. We have to remember that this is fantasy, so it's kind of silly and fun and made up. No nursery could have possibly have been conducted more correctly, and Mr. Darling knew it. Yet sometimes he wondered uneasily whether the neighbors talked. He had his position in the city to consider. Nana also troubled him in another way. He had sometimes a feeling that she did not admire him. I know she admires you tremendously, George, Mrs. Darling would assure him, and then she would sign the children to be specifically nice to their father. Lovely dances followed, in which the only other servant, Liza, was sometimes allowed to join. She looked silly in her long skirt and maid's cap, though she had sworn, when engaged, that she would never see 10 again. the gaiety of those romps. And the gayest of all was Mrs. Darling, who would pirouette so wildly that all you could see of her was that kiss, and then if you dashed at her, you might have gotten it. There never was a simpler, happier family until the coming of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter when she was tidying up her children's minds. It was the nightly custom of every good mother, after her children are asleep, to rummage in their minds and put things straight for next morning, repacking into their proper places the many articles that have wandered during the day. If you could keep awake, but of course you can't, you would see your own mother doing this, and you would find it very interesting to watch her. It is quite like tidying up drawers. You would see her on her knees, I expect, lingering humorously over some of your contents, wondering where on earth you had picked this thing up, making discovery sweet and not so sweet, pressing this into her cheek as if it were nice as a kitten, and hurriedly stowing that out of sight. When you wake in the morning, the naughtiness and evil passions with which you went to bed have been folded up small and placed at the bottom of your mind, and on the top, beautifully aired, are spread out all your prettier thoughts, ready for you to put on. Is that what moms do? Do they rummage around in our minds at night? I don't think so, but it's silly to think about it. I don't know whether you have ever seen a map of a person's mind. Doctors sometimes draw maps of other parts of you, and your own map can become intensely interesting. But catch them trying to draw a map of a child's mind, which is not only confused, but keeps going round all the time. There are zigzagging lines on it, just like your temperature on a card. And these are probably roads on the island, for the Neverland is always more or less an island, with astonishing splashes of color here and there, and coral reefs and rakish-looking craft in the offing, and savages and lonely lairs, and gnomes who are mostly tailors, and caves through which a river runs, and princes with 6 elder brothers, and a hut fast going to decay, and one very small old lady with a hooked nose. It would be an easy map if that were all, but there's also the first day at school, religion, fathers, the round pond, needlework, verbs that make the dative, chocolate pudding day, getting into braces, say 99, 3 pence for pulling out your tooth, and so on. And either these are part of the island, or they are another map showing through, and it is all rather confusing, especially as nothing will stand still. Of course, the Neverlands vary a good deal. John's, for instance, had a lagoon with flamingos flying over it at which John was shooting, while Michael, who was very small, had a flamingo with lagoons flying over it. John lived in a boat turned upside down on the sands, and Michael lived in a wigwam, and Wendy lived in a house of leaves deftly sewn together. John had no friends in his Neverland of his mind. Michael had friends at night, and Wendy had a pet wolf forsaken by its parents. But on the whole, the Neverlands have a family resemblance, and if they stood still in a row, you could say of them that they each have each other's noses, and so forth. On these magic shores, children at play are forever breaching their coracles. We too have been there. We can still hear the sound of the surf, through which we shall land no more. Of all delectable islands, the Neverland is the snuggest and most compact, not large and sprawly, with tedious distances between one adventure and another, but nicely crammed. When you play at it by day with the chairs and the tablecloth, it is not in the least alarming, but in the 2 minutes before you go to sleep, it becomes very nearly real. That is why there are night lights. Occasionally in her travels, through her children's minds, Mrs. Darling found things she could not understand. Of these, quite the most perplexing was the word Peter. She knew of no Peter, and yet he was here and there in John and Michael's minds, while Wendy's began to be scrawled all over with him. The name stood out in bolder letters than any of the other words, and as Mrs. Darling gazed, she felt that it had an oddly cocky appearance. Yes, he is rather cocky, Wendy admitted with regret. Her mother had been questioning her. But who is he? He is Peter Pan, you know, Mother. At first Mrs. Darling did not know, but after thinking back into her childhood, she remembered a Peter Pan who was said to live with the fairies. There were odd stories about him, as that when children died he went part of the way with them, so that they should not be frightened. She had believed in him at the time, but now that she was married and full of sense, she quite doubted whether there was any such person. Besides, she said to Wendy, he would be grown up by this time. Oh no, he isn't grown up, Wendy assured her confidently, and he is just my size. She meant that he was her size in both mind and body. She didn't know how she knew it. She just knew it. Mrs. Darling consulted Mr. Darling, but he smiled. Mark my words, he said. It is some nonsense the Nana has been putting into their heads. Just the sort of idea a dog would have. Leave it alone, and it will blow over." But it would not blow over, and soon the troublesome boy gave Mrs. Darling quite a shock. Children have the strangest adventures without being troubled by them. For instance, they may remember to mention a week after the event happened that when they were in the wood they met their dead father and had a game with him. It was in this casual way that Wendy one morning made a disquieting revelation. Some leaves of a tree had been found on the nursery floor, which certainly were not there when the children went to bed. Mrs. Darling was puzzling over them when Wendy said with a tolerant smile, "I do believe it is that Peter again." "Whatever do you mean, Wendy?" "It is so naughty of him," said Wendy. She was a tidy child. She explained in quite a matter-of-fact way that she thought Peter sometimes came to the nursery in the night and sat on the foot of her bed and played his pipes to her. Unfortunately, she never woke, so she didn't know how she knew this happened. She just knew it. "What nonsense you talk, Precious. No one can get into the house without knocking." "I think he comes in by the window," she said. "My love, it is 3 floors up," answered her mother. "Were not the leaves at the foot of the window, Mother?" It was quite true. The leaves had been found very near the window. Mrs. Darling did not know what to think, for it all seemed so natural to Wendy that you could not dismiss it by saying she had been dreaming. "My child," the mother cried, "why did you not tell me of this before?" "I forgot," said Wendy. She was in a hurry to get to her breakfast. Oh, surely she must have been dreaming. But, on the other hand, there were the leaves. Mrs. Darling examined them carefully. They were skeleton leaves, but she was quite sure they did not come from any tree that grew in England. She crawled about the floor, peering at it with a candle for marks of a strange foot. She rattled the poker up the chimney and tapped the walls. She let down a tape from the window to the pavement, and it was a sheer drop of 30 feet, without so much as a sprout to climb up by. Certainly Wendy had been dreaming. But Wendy had not been dreaming, as the very next night showed, and the night on which the extraordinary adventures of these children may be said to have begun. On the night we speak of, all the children were once more in bed. It happened to be Nana's evening off, and Mrs. Darling had bathed them and sung to them one by one till they had let her go of her hand and slid away into the land of sleep. All were looking so safe and cozy that she smiled at her fears now and sat down tranquilly by the fire to sew. It was something for Michael, who on his birthday was getting into shirts. The fire was warm, however, and the nursery dimly lit by 3 night lights, and was presently the sewing lay on Mrs. Darling's lap. Her head nodded so gracefully, and she was asleep. Look at the 4 of them, Wendy and Michael over there, John here, and Mrs. Darling by the fire. There should have been a 4th night light. While she slept, Mrs. Darling had a dream. She dreamt that the Neverland had come too near, and that a strange boy had broken through it. He did not alarm her, for she thought she had seen him before in the faces of many women who have no children. Perhaps he is to be found in the faces of some mothers too. But in her dream, he had rent the film that obscures the Neverland, and she saw Wendy and John and Michael peeping through the gap. The dream by itself would have been a trifle, but while she was dreaming, the window of the nursery blew open, and a boy did drop on the floor. He was accompanied by a strange light, no bigger than your fist, which darted about the room like a living thing, and I think it must have been this light that awakened Mrs. Darling. She startled up with a cry, and saw the boy, and somehow she knew at once that he was Peter Pan. If you or I or Wendy had been there, we would have seen that he was very much like Mrs. Darling's kiss. He was a lovely boy, clad in skeleton leaves and the juices that ooze out of the trees, but the most entrancing thing about him was that he had all his first teeth. When he saw she was a grown-up, he smiled his smile at her. That was the end of chapter 1. What do you think? I'm excited to meet Peter Pan. I wonder if they're going to go on adventures. I think some of the language is very interesting, like the way the mothers root about in their kids' minds at night. I don't think that really happens, but I think it's fun to think about. Thanks for reading that with me. Oh, and today's code word of the day is armchair. Thanks for reading Armchair Adventures with me. Have a fun day, and be sure to log your code word so you get a raffle ticket. Thanks for reading with me.